So if you're dealing with fibromyalgia type symptoms, I feel like we're gonna be friends. It's gonna kind of be like we went to battle together because I don't like how you're being treated as a human with this situation. Fibromyalgia basically translates into you hurt, it sucks, and we don't know why. So the information that's out there as far as solutions and answers and how to even just reduce the pain that you're dealing with, it's pretty worthless. So in this video, I want to help you find some answers for yourself. I'm going to help you understand what seems to be the most common underlying causes for these fibromyalgia type symptoms. And the weird thing is that they're actually going to make sense to you. And I'm going to help you understand steps you can take to improve those situations. Now, just keep in mind that I'm not a doctor. I'm not giving you medical advice. I'm just a schmuck comedian turned nutrition author because 20 years ago, when I lost my voice for 8 years, 23 different doctors couldn't help me figure it out. I had to dig in and find my own answers. And what's really interesting is that since I've been doing this for 20 years now, I've found all the information that I needed in the medical literature, and yet none of those 23 doctors knew any of that information. So I'm going to share some studies with you guys to help you dig in if you need to dig into these things a little bit more. It's okay if I'm standing in front of these. You don't need to see them. I'm going to make them big so you can see it. And I'm also going to put a link in the description below so you can dig into any of these studies that you want to look into a little bit further. And when you understand some of these things, I'm probably going to have to apologize for putting off making this video. This is just a topic that kind of makes me mad. You know, 2 years before I lost my voice, my mom passed away way too young. And I feel like this is what led her down that path. They told her, like, to fix this fibromyalgia stuff, you just exercise. And she's like, you want me to what? Like, her pain was way too severe to do any type of exercise. She couldn't even stand in the kitchen long enough to cook anything and just ended up eating a bunch of fast food and just going down a spiral that way. And I hear from a lot of people who just feel stuck like this. They feel like they're not really getting any real answers. So I did not learn this information in time to help my mom, but I did learn this in time to help you. So if you've watched my videos before, you know I never ask you guys for anything. I don't even say, can you click the like button? I don't really ask for things, but I'm asking for something now. If you're dealing with this, I want you to improve this situation for yourself. And I want you to go to your doctor and tell them the steps that you took to improve this situation. And the more that they hear that from people, that there's natural ways to improve this, they have to eventually start to listen a little bit. And then I want you to do one more thing. I want you to share this with someone else who's suffering from this issue. And if you don't know somebody else, I want you to find somebody and I want you to share this with them so that we can turn this situation around. Now, this video might get a little bit longer than some of my others because I want you to understand these things the best that I can help you understand them, because the more you understand, the easier it's going to be to take the steps to fix the issue. You're not going to be able to just take a pill and fix everything. It's going to take some effort, but when you understand what's going on, it makes the effort a whole lot easier. So to understand what's really creating this issue for most people, it's not going to be for everybody, but for most people, we need to understand how the body creates energy. It has multiple ways to do this. And it really likes to use cellular respiration, which includes some oxidation steps, and it can also use some fermentation. But this is the preferred method of the body to create energy. It can create a lot more energy doing this method than it can with this method. But to do this, the body needs oxygen. So when oxygen is not available at those tissue levels for those cells to create energy and such, when there's not enough oxygen, that's when the body will use this fermentation process. So when the body creates energy through cellular respiration, the byproduct or the exhaust of that process is carbon dioxide. So we just exhale carbon dioxide. So when that exhaust from this process takes place, we just breathe out, and that's how we get rid of that CO2. But the byproduct or the exhaust really from creating energy through fermentation is lactic acid. So that's different. So the body can take lactic acid and it can kind of convert it back to glucose and then use that as a fuel source. So that's kind of something that it has to do to deal with the lactic acid, where with this CO2, we just kind of breathe it out and then it's removed. But this method is really to be used in just short little spurts, you know, to create energy in an urgent situation. Maybe you're doing a very intense exercise and your cells are running out of oxygen. So they're like, oh, we're just going to switch over to this fermentation, and then it creates lactic acid as that byproduct. And that's why those muscles can really start to hurt as that lactic acid accumulates, and then the person stops doing that type of exercise for a few minutes, and the lactic acid can dissipate again, and then they can go and do more of that exercise. But we're going to talk about some things in this video that help us understand that sometimes this fermentation process of creating energy is not being used for short spurts. There's situations in the body where that might be all the body has to do. Well, this is what I got, so I'm going to create energy any way that I can. And when that's the case, then we can have an accumulation of this lactic acid. And as that lactic acid accumulates in the tissues, then it's basically going to be like frying the nerve endings and creating a lot of pain that way. So when it's not just using it for these short spurts, it's using this most of the time. You can also see that in this way of creating energy, the body can create like 19 times more energy from the same fuel source as it can from this. So that may also explain why we see so much chronic fatigue syndrome associated with this fibromyalgia type issue. If a person is stuck making their energy this way, not only are they creating a lot more lactic acid that's going to accumulate if the body can't get rid of it, but they're also creating a lot less energy because it's just not as efficient. So it makes sense that they would have this chronic fatigue issue if somebody else using the same fuel source is making 19 times the energy that they may be making by just using this fermentation process. So this can be a really big problem and is usually the underlying driver of this fibromyalgia type pain. We just need to understand that there's a variety of ways that this can come about, and that's why the scientific world has such a problem saying, oh yeah, this is the problem. Because different people dealing with fibromyalgia can have the underlying cause be very different from someone else. So it's hard to really lock something down. But all you need to do is what's creating the problem for you. You don't need to save the world. Let's just help you improve your situation. So when we're looking at this, it's really about oxygen utilization. Remember right here, the body needs oxygen for this cellular respiration to take place. So what are the reasons that someone might not have enough oxygen? And to understand how important this is, you can just try holding your breath for an hour and a half. And I probably don't really want you to do that. You're going to know that you can't do that. That's not even possible for us to do that for most situations because the body needs oxygen to function correctly. So that should help us understand that when there's certain areas of the body that are not getting enough oxygen, things will likely go awry. So when we're looking at this oxygen utilization and the body's need to use it correctly, we need to understand what's called the Bohr effect. And this is something that a lot of us learned in the 8th grade science class and we just never talked about it again. But it basically tells us that the pH of the blood needs to be in a very specific range or we just kind of die. So the body puts a lot of effort into keeping that pH in the right range. And if that blood starts to lean a little bit too far on the alkaline side, the Bohr effect kicks in and says that oxygen cannot leave the blood and get down to the tissues where it needs to be. So the body has a lot of backup mechanisms that it tries to kind of balance this out a little bit. One thing that we can look at is our breath rate. So when we're looking at the pH of the blood, that carbon dioxide or CO2 is very acidic. So when the body doesn't have the right pH in the blood, it'll adjust the rate at which we're breathing in an effort to balance out that pH. So if the blood is leaning too alkaline, the body will slow the rate at which it's breathing, hold on to more CO2 that way, and then the acidic CO2 balances out the pH of the blood, and then oxygen can get down to the tissues where it needs to be. So the way that we can use this information is that we can just look at what is our natural breath rate. Now to look at this, you can just use a stopwatch or the timer on your phone or something and just set it for 60 seconds and then just try to relax, try to breathe normal, and then count the number of inhales you take in that 60 seconds. Don't count inhale 1, exhale 2, just count the inhales. Now if that number of breaths that you took in a minute is lower than 12, that's a sign that you're leaning too far on that alkaline side in the bloodstream. And if the blood is leaning too alkaline, then we know that the oxygen can't get down to the tissues where it needs to be so the body can create energy this way. It wants to create it that way. But if the blood is too alkaline, now the oxygen can't get down there and the body's gonna be like, well, what do I do now? Oh yeah, I got this thing. I'll use the fermentation. I'll create energy through fermentation and the byproduct is going to be lactic acid. Now keep in mind that this checking your breath rate is not a diagnostic thing, and your doctor may put a pulse oximeter on your finger and be like, oh man, your oxygen's great, look at that. But the oxygen's great in the blood, yeah, but it's trapped there and it can't get down to the tissues where it needs to be utilized to create energy the right way. So if your breath rate is below 12, and I've seen clients that were like 5, 4 or 5, per minute, but that's a really strong indication that the blood is leaning too alkaline, which means that makes sense why you're dealing with this pain. If the body can't use oxygen to create energy, it has to use this, which means the lactic acid is going to be the byproduct and it's likely going to accumulate if the issue is so severe that your body needs to create energy through fermentation most of the time. So now things start to make sense. So one thing that we can look at, just if our breath rate is really low, just changing the rate at which you breathe is not going to fix the problem. You can't take an angry dog that's barking at you and yelling at you and just grab his tail and wag it. Because, hey, well, dogs with a wagging their tail, they're happy. You can't just fix the problem by wagging the tail. You have to fix the underlying cause of the problem. But one thing called the Bacterial breathing method, they have some exercises, and there's one that if you can get to the point where you can walk and go for a walk, you might have to do this just resting at first, but if you can only breathe through your nose, so you keep your mouth closed the whole time that you're taking the walk and you just breathe through your nose, that has the ability to kind of change the set point of that CO2 in the system, and it can help acidify that blood a little bit and help more oxygen get down to the tissues. So if you're walking too fast that you can't breathe that way, then you need to slow down and make it a little bit easier. Make it an easy walk so that you can do that walk for 30 minutes with your mouth closed and you're not talking to your friend or anything, you're just breathing through your nose. That can have the ability to create a slight amount of improvement for some people alone. But we need to dig a little bit further and understand, well, why is the blood leaning too alkaline in the first place? And one of the more common reasons with the wide variety of people that I've been able to help improve this issue has been high blood sugar. And we'll look at this study here on obesity and insulin resistance in fibromyalgia patients. And they came to the conclusion that fibromyalgia patients have a higher degree of insulin resistance compared to healthy age-matched controls. And I'll put some links to some other studies below that kind of confirm this as well. There was even one study that was completely contracted that really showed that insulin resistance really lined up with this fibromyalgia, and they had it just removed. I guess somebody didn't want you to understand that. They're like, they turned it in wrong and they didn't fill out this paper right, so we're just going to get rid of the whole study. But this has become very apparent from a variety of papers that I'll link in the description below, that we're looking at this insulin resistance, and if you understand how this works a little bit, this is really going to make sense to you. So here's one thing that we have to look at. When we're looking at insulin resistance, we know that the blood sugar is going to be higher because the cells are not responding to the insulin and processing that glucose correctly. Okay, everybody knows that so far. But one problem with that is that calcium likes to follow sugar, just like you would follow the ice cream truck when you were 8. Calcium goes where sugar is. So if sugar is high in the bloodstream, calcium is going to leave the tissues and other places where it's supposed to be and go and follow that sugar. So we get to where calcium is displaced. And calcium is one of the most alkaline substances on the planet, so that has the ability to push the pH of that blood to a more alkaline side because it's so filled with this alkaline calcium. So we know that when the blood is leaning too alkaline, that's a problem. Oxygen can't get down to the tissues. But another thing we want to look at is, let's look at this study here on modulation of pressure, pain thresholds during and following isometric contraction in patients with fibromyalgia. And this study suggested that the patients with fibromyalgia, their muscles have a harder time relaxing and they stay more in that contracted state, which can really elevate pain sensitivity. And this paper on cramps listed fibromyalgia as one of the most common comorbidities that's affecting patients and their quality of life, is that these muscle cramp type situations keep coming up. So what we understand is that calcium is one of the most important tissues that allows those muscles to relax. And when too much calcium is pulled out of the tissues, that's when we see those muscle cramps. So this makes sense that, well, the calcium is being pulled out of the tissues because of the high sugar levels, and then those tissues become more, contracted, more tight, with a lot more increased pain sensitivity that could happen before the cramp would show up, and then eventually if it gets severe enough, then we see the cramp. So if a person is having like Charlie horse type cramps, with this fibromyalgia thing, that can be a really big clue. That doesn't mean everybody's going to experience these cramps, but it helps us understand what could be going on if everything is in this like contracted state, so to speak. And another thing that we see with a lot of type 2 diabetics and people that are leaning insulin resistant is that their breath rate is very low because CO2 is a byproduct of processing carbohydrates correctly. But somebody who's insulin resistant is not processing those carbohydrates correctly. So they're not creating that CO2 and the blood starts to lean more on that alkaline side. And then we get these oxygen utilization issues that causes the need for this fermentation that's going to create more lactic acid. So if this is part of the problem for you, then lowering blood sugar would be a really big deal. And you know, a person can kind of just look at their fasting blood sugar to get an idea. This is not diagnostic. We really need to look at fasting insulin to know where that's going on, and a doctor would need to do that for you. But a person can buy a glucometer at a drugstore for $40 and just look at it first thing in the morning, right when they wake up, look at that fasting blood sugar number. And if it's over 100, then that's a sign that a person is leaning more on that insulin resistance side. Now, there is a situation where it can be lower and the person is still moving into that insulin resistance situation. They're just not quite severe yet. But if your fasting blood sugar is over 100, oh man, it's like 115, well, that's a really strong sign that you're leaning on this insulin resistance side, and all of these issues that come with it could be creating this problem for you. So the solution is to lower the blood sugar. Now, a great way to do that, let's look at this study here on non-ketogenic low carbohydrate diet predicts lower affective distress, higher energy levels, and decreased fibromyalgia symptoms. So this was in a study that they really looked at like middle-aged females with this. But the reason they said this non-keto low-carb situation is because for some people, a ketogenic diet has the ability to magnify this problem. Now, some people are going to go on a ketogenic diet and they're going to feel a whole lot better because they're really reducing a lot of those carbohydrates that they're bringing in, so that's going to lower their blood sugar. And then calcium is not going to follow sugar so much. All this calcium is not going to leave the tissues where it needs to be and make that bloodstream way too alkaline. But again, remember, that person doing this ketogenic diet is also going to be creating less CO2. And CO2 is acidic to the bloodstream. So for some people, they're just going to magnify this alkalizing bloodstream problem by using a ketogenic diet. So this study found that a non-keto low carbohydrate diet, where they were still consuming some carbohydrates so they can create some of this CO2 and get that byproduct that keeps that bloodstream balanced out, but they were still lowering the carbs and lowering their blood sugar so that all this calcium is not going into the bloodstream, creating all this problem. And just understand that you're not going to fix insulin resistance and high blood sugar by going on a low-carb diet for a week and a half. That situation will take some time and effort. So one thing that you need to understand is that if you've never done a low-carb diet and you go to a low-carb diet all of a sudden, then cravings could really derail your situation. So if you're having cravings, we need to look at this next section because that's almost always due to digestive malfunctions, where a person just is really breaking the food down the way that they're supposed to and accessing all the minerals and nutrients in that food. And when minerals and nutrients go low in the body's going to scream for easy fuel sources, like just give me that sugar. You were able to break that down really, really easy. Give me some Nilla wafers and I'll make that work right now. So people get really bad cravings, but if they can fix digestive malfunctions, then those cravings will not be so severe and it'll be easy to do a low-carb diet. They'll actually feel much better in that situation. So I'm not going to dig too deep into digestion in this video. I talk about that in pretty much every other video that I've made. But if you're having any type of digestive symptoms at all, any burping or bloating or acid reflux or constipation or diarrhea or nausea or even like skin or acne issues, or maybe food just feels like it sits there like a rock in your stomach for 6 hours, any of those things are signs that there are digestive malfunctions restricting your ability to break your food down correctly, and those need to be corrected. So we'll put a link in the description below for our totally free digestion course, and that free course will walk you through figuring out which aspects of digestion are not working correctly and steps you can take to improve that. And you're going to find out in a minute that that's going to be really important because we need the sides of digestion. We need to have enough stomach acid working correctly. We need our bile flowing correctly to really be able to bust the food apart and make everything work the way that it's supposed to. Now, the next possible underlying cause we need to understand is this anabolic imbalance. And it was Dr. Emmanuel Revisi who helped us understand that the body has this natural circadian rhythm at the cellular level. So it's during the day, we should be in a catabolic state where the body's really good at creating energy the right way and also breaking down so that it can be rebuilt and renewed. And then at night, we should move into an anabolic state where the body's really good at sleeping and resting, but also repairing and rebuilding. So both of these states are good. They're both appropriate. We want both of them to happen. But for a wide variety of reasons, some people can get really stuck in one of these states. And if they're really stuck in one of these states, then that can create a whole lot of trouble. So if someone's stuck in this anabolic state, the problem that we're looking at here is that in that state, the body prefers to create energy through this fermentation process. So a lot of people that we see with these anabolic imbalances have problems that can come from creating energy too often through fermentation. So we see things like anxiety and constipation. And the constipation issue comes about because in that anabolic state, the body's going to send too much water to the kidneys and not enough to the bowels. And then the stool can get dry and hard. Now there's other causes of constipation. I've talked about those a lot, but this is just one possible cause. And anxiety also has different possible causes that can come about. We have a lot of videos on anxiety, but one possible cause is excess lactic acid. So I have a link below that kind of shows us that a lot of times when they're studying what's going to help somebody get out of a panic attack, they have to create a panic attack first to kind of see what's going to help them get out of that. And they do that by injecting them with lactic acid. It's called a lactate-induced panic attack. So they understand that when lactic acid goes very high, it can create a panic attack, but nobody ever talks about the fact that lactic acid going pretty high can cause anxiety for a lot of people. So it's really common to see anxiety with fibromyalgia, and of course they're going to say, well, you're having pain all the time. It makes sense that you would be anxious about that. But we like to look at the actual physiology of what's going on in the body, and this makes sense. This anxiety going high for some people with fibromyalgia, not all, but for some, it makes sense because they're dealing with that. You'll also see some people that say, well, my fibromyalgia gets a lot worse at night, especially when I wake up, when I've been asleep that night. That's when it really is the worst. And that's because the body's moving more into that anabolic state at night and throughout the night. And it's creating even more of its energy through that fermentation because the body's more in that anabolic state. So if a person is leaning too far on that anabolic side, when we can take steps to improve that imbalance, well, now they have a different set point. Now the body's not creating as much energy through that fermentation because it's in more of a catabolic state during the day like it's supposed to be. So that free course, the free digestion course that I linked for you below, that also walks you through running simple self-tests at home with tools you can pick up like at a pharmacy or a health food store to get an idea, am I leaning way too far on this anabolic side? Because if you are, you really want to create some cellular balance there. You really want the body to be able to move back and forth to both states like it's supposed to. But one thing that's interesting, we'll look at this study on high-dose omega-3 alters serum magnesium and calcium levels and affects fibromyalgia symptoms. And they're looking at how omega-3 can kind of affect where calcium is. And omega-3s push calcium back down into the tissue level where it's supposed to be. So now all this calcium isn't floating around in the bloodstream and alkalizing the bloodstream and has the ability to help more oxygen get to the tissues. And we also understand that omega-3s are very pro-catabolic. So they're helping push a person less anabolic. So it makes sense that these studies are showing, oh man, yes, you just use a whole bunch of omega-3s. It's going to make you feel better. For some underlying causes, it really has the ability to improve those scenarios for some people. But that's also why we don't see it improving the situation for everybody. Omega-3s also have the ability to push a person more insulin resistant. So if this insulin resistance up here is the main cause that's creating this problem for you, then taking omega-3s could actually magnify the problem long term. So we really like people to look at their body chemistry to get an idea of where they are to understand the steps that are going to work well for them. We also see people saying, oh, just supplement with magnesium, that'll make you feel better as well. Magnesium also very pro-catabolic. That's why this could help some people if they're leaning too far on that anabolic side. Also interesting is this study on a systemic review of the association between fibromyalgia and functional gastrointestinal disorders. And they say this review confirms previous reports that IBS is common in people with fibromyalgia and suggests that IBS mixed and constipation types are really the highest number that you're going to see. And that makes sense that if they're way too anabolic, that's going to make them lean toward that constipation side as well. And the last thing with this anabolic imbalances, they're telling everybody that you need to do exercise and such. And exercise is a pro-catabolic activity. You're breaking these body parts, these tissues down to kind of help need them to be rebuilt and renewed. It's a catabolic activity. So if you can get a person to be able to exercise, then that's pushing the body a little bit more into that catabolic state. Another thing that if a person can exercise enough, it's kind of forcing the body to try to create energy this way. And so if they do it long enough and often enough, then it has the ability to start changing how the body's creating energy more with this oxygen method and less with the fermentation. So that's why people, and long ago, that was really the only solution that they would offer is just go and exercise, because if they were able to make it happen, they often saw improvement. And this study on exercise therapy for fibromyalgia kind of confirmed that, look, we're seeing improvements now in this study just like they did long ago. So it seems to be a real method, and you can see why. It has the ability to improve 2 different scenarios that could possibly creating the pain for a person. And when we're looking at the IBS type issues, we need to understand problems that can come about from a bacterial overgrowth. And we'll look at this study here. A link between irritable bowel syndrome and fibromyalgia may be related to findings on lactulose breath testing. And that's what they kind of use sometimes to look to see if there's a SIBO or a small intestinal bacterial overgrowth issue going on. And this study found that a lot of people with this fibromyalgia issue also showed that they had SIBO. So we're looking at issues like IBS and SIBO, and again, these are digestive malfunctions. These are issues going wrong with this digestion. But what's really important to understand is that there's some types of bacteria, these bad guys that come in and set up camp in the small intestine where they shouldn't be, they also can put out lactic acid. It's a byproduct of them creating energy, is this lactic acid. And it's actually a different type of lactic acid. It's D-lactic acid. Some people might call that right spin lactic acid. But the problem is it can be a difference between the body converting the lactic acid to glucose or having to excrete it. And the D-lactic acid has to be excreted. It can't be converted to glucose. Now, when we're trying to convert this lactic acid to glucose, I have a paper below that shows us that when someone's leaning on this insulin resistance side, that has the ability to restrict that pathway. So it makes it harder for the person to convert that lactic acid to glucose. Now even more lactic acid is going to accumulate, right? And it's going to make those tissues more acidic and more pain. But also if somebody has an overgrowth issue and that type of bacteria happens to be creating a lot of this D-lactate, that's going to accumulate as well. So now there's different mechanisms that are accumulating even more lactic acid when we're looking at a SIBO type issue. So if someone has some type of overgrowth, either in the stomach or the small intestine, or a dysbiosis where all these bad guys have come into the large intestine and they've kind of taken over and it's just not a good neighborhood anymore, then taking steps to reduce that overgrowth are going to be a very big deal, especially if the type of bacteria is creating all of this lactic acid on top of what the body may already be dealing with. So fixing that problem could really bring lactic acid levels down. Another thing is when you're fixing this overgrowth, we really want to go back to these digestive malfunctions and make sure that the person is making enough HCl in their stomach. It's very common for someone not to be making enough hydrochloric acid or stomach acid. And we need to make sure that they are so that they can shut the front door. That stomach acid in the stomach is the barrier that keeps all these bad varmints from coming in and setting up camp. So if somebody's using some type of acid reflux medication that turns off stomach acid, that could be making that too low and leaving the front door open. We've talked about lots of studies that show that PPI use has the ability to open up the door so bad overgrowth situations can set up camp. Now, if you're using a medication, I'm certainly not telling you to stop using it, but that free digestion course explains how to fix the actual underlying causes of those issues so that a person doesn't need to turn off their stomach acid. Now, the last possible underlying cause that I want to talk about is a vitamin B1 deficiency, also known as thiamine. And we'll look at this study here on an overview of type B lactic acidosis due to thiamine or B1 deficiency. And this kind of image here kind of shows us that thiamine or vitamin B1 is a really necessary cofactor in this process of creating energy this way, through this cellular respiration. And when there's not enough vitamin B1, then the body's like, well, I can't do that. I guess I got to do this. And that has the ability to make the body switch over to creating energy through fermentation, which is going to create that lactic acid excess. So this can be a big deal, and there's some people that are saying, hey, you just treat fibromyalgia just with a high dose B1. Just do that and you're going to fix everything. I've never used that with any of my clients that I've helped improve this issue, because whenever I'm working with a client and they have digestive malfunctions, I'm always working to fix those too. And a lot of times there's a deficiency because the body's not breaking down foods. B1 is in a lot of the foods that most people eat. And so they're just not able to access all of those vitamins and nutrients in the food because they're not breaking it down correctly. And another thing is that when we process carbohydrates and sugars, the body needs B1 to make that happen. And so if someone's just pounding processed junk food and sugars and carbs all the time, then they're really using up that vitamin B1. So you take a person that can't digest very well, they have any digestive symptom at all, which I have learned to find is almost most humans, and they're also eating all these carbs and sugars, also most humans. So they have two things working against them when it comes to this B1. So some people, when they really use a lot of B1, they have the ability to create some improvement. So I think this is okay to do. This is worth putting in your favor just to make sure. And just know that you really want to use like a natural thiamine. You don't want to use a synthetic, junk, easy, cheap B1 vitamin that you bought at the drugstore. You want to use something that is a natural form of it. And also, if you were going to take this B1 every day, you would probably also want to take a B complex, 2 or 3 times a week. Because a lot of times for a supplemental B vitamin to be effective, you also need all those B cofactors that come in a complex form of like a B complex. So I just recommend people use those anytime they're going to go this route. So again, I don't like to just say, oh, just do this and you're going to fix everything. Most people are not, because the B1 is not going to make a person less insulin resistant. It's just kind of helping them fix a problem that they're creating by eating all those carbs. But a person still needs to change the way that they're eating. So this was a lot of stuff. Look at all these things that we just kind of talked about here. You can see that there isn't one solution that's going to work for everybody, which is why the medical world is kind of like, yeah, we don't know. I don't know what to tell you. Yeah, it did help that one guy, but it didn't help this other guy, so obviously that's not the solution. But the reality is that we're not really going to fix any problem, including this, until we learn how to look at the person instead of the problem. When we can look at the person, then we can figure out, they're leaning way too far on this anabolic side. Oh man, look at their fasting blood sugar, it's way too high. It makes sense that that's the problem for them. But if we can look at the person, then we can figure out the issue for them and figure out the best steps for them to take. Instead of having them just do what their neighbor did since it worked for them, we really got to look at the person. So I kind of screamed through a lot of this because I'm a bit of a maniac. Just don't let that overwhelm you. You might have to watch this video 12 times to really allow some of these things to sink in. Every time you watch it, you're going to realize something else that you didn't, oh yeah, that makes sense that really connects there. So don't be afraid to watch this a few times to really understand the steps that are going to be right for you. And then go through that free digestion course. It's totally free to figure out, are there malfunctions in my digestion that need to be corrected? Are there imbalances where I'm leaning way too far on this side, obviously, and if I fix that, that's going to improve the situation. See what's going to help you the most. And just remember, when you create some improvement for yourself about this, I want to hear about this, but I also want other people to hear about it. Make sure that you're helping someone else find their answers just like you found yours. Now, right now, since this oxygen utilization issue is such a big deal, you can jump over and check out our video on how to improve oxygen utilization. I can't wait to hear about your results.